This video is sponsored by Surfshark. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union has sold hundreds of combat aircraft to dozens of nations. After the Soviet Union dissolved, Russia continued the sales in the 1990s. Its aerospace sector was still quite potent. Its products offered decent-ish capability for not a lot of money, something many countries around the world needed, especially ones not being able to afford the Western hardware. But as the 21st century entered its second decade, things started to change. Nowadays, the list of countries buying Russian combat planes is short, and is mostly composed of just the countries in its immediate sphere of influence. This video will explore the numbers, analyze each and every recent purchase as well as a failed bid, and answer the question, why is almost no one buying Russian fighter jets anymore? Fighter jets rely on data links. Crucially, those must remain secured. Secure communication is what Surfshark VPN, which is sponsoring this video, is all about. Surfshark is a virtual private network, an app for your computer or phone which reroutes and encrypts all your internet data, so your device is not exposed to big companies or cyber criminals. Surfshark swaps the real location of your device with a new one, making it seem you're connecting to the internet from somewhere else. For example, I often have to research military topics which may raise eyebrows. I like to search from different IP addresses. Also, some military video sites I use can throttle traffic if too much demand comes from one address. So again, it speeds up my production to segment downloads from different addresses. Surfshark offers over 3,200 servers to choose from in 100 countries. If you're on holiday abroad and some streaming content appears unavailable to you, IP address change will help. If you're using public Wi-Fi, which is notoriously unsafe, Surfshark will help as well. By encrypting your traffic, a hack of the Wi-Fi will not affect you. Surfshark is giving Binkov viewers a special deal. If you follow the link below the video and use my code BinkovBattle, you will get extra 4 months for free on your Surfshark deal. Surfshark offers a 30-day money-back guarantee, so there's no risk to try it out. Back in the 1990s, Russia was not seen as an adversary by the US. The US had its usual roster of client countries that would buy its aircraft, and Russia had its countries. Let's take a look at countries operating Soviet/Russian planes in the 1990s and 2000s. The list was quite long, though most of those had planes that were procured back in the Cold War. Some additional countries may have procured second-hand ex-Soviet airframes, but those haven't been included. There may also be a few small countries operating a handful of old airframes omitted from the list. But let's take a more detailed look at Russian sales after the Cold War ended. From 1991 to the year 2000, Stockholm International Peace Research Institute database says that from 1991 to the year 2000, combat aircraft transfers included 11 countries buying fighter jets from Russia, for a total of over 370 jets. That was the period when China was buying scores of planes, almost 220 bought by China alone. India bought 60, and some of the other big purchases like Hungary's and Slovakia's were a way for Russia to pay off the Soviet Union's debt. Further sales of new aircraft, not including second-hand ones, were still going strong during the 2000s. Some 11 or so countries are listed as buying new Russian planes in SIPRI's database. Give or take a few, as again some of those may have been second-hand ones. The total exported by Russia is even stronger at over 480 airframes. One can even say that the 2000s were the golden period, but it's noticeable that India accounts for half of those sales. From 2011 to 2020, when the whole decade is examined, purchases were still healthy, though the number of countries dropped to 8 or 9, depending on second-hand purchases. And the total number of planes sold dropped to a little fewer than 200. Basically, the big clients, India and China, curtailed their orders. Then in the last few years, a drought came. While the list shows 3 countries and 70 aircraft, let's remember that inaccuracies are possible. For example, while SIPRI lists Su-30 for India, those are marked under a question mark. Indeed, it would appear that while such a deal was floated around 2020, it has not yet materialized. In 2022, a US official said India cancelled said order, among others like helicopters and modernization of existing Su-30s. Then in 2023 came word India's Defense Acquisition Council approved the Su-30 purchase, but details are still unclear. As for Algeria, evidence of Algeria's ordering yet another batch of MiG-29s is scant, so that order too may in fact be exaggerated, and may be a mistake counting the same order from the 2010s twice. The only really likely order is Iran's. Iran's Tasnim news agency confirmed the order in late 2023. Iran's Shahir al-Haidari said jets will come March 2024 onward. So how come Russia crashed from 400 to 500 jets per decade in the 1990s and 2000s to this? Is the war in Ukraine part of the reason? Sure, yes, but to a small extent. Plane contracts, once finalized, need around 2 years to start deliveries. So if a country wanted to order a plane from Russia in the summer of 2022, after the war started, it's likely those deliveries would not be visible yet. It's plausible Russia decided sometime in late 2020 that it needs all the fighter jet production it can muster, so any new export deals might have taken a back seat. Iran is a special case, but we'll get to that. Another way the war might have impacted sales is through perceived performance. The Russian Air Force did not and is not performing all that well, despite the opponent being perceived as many times less numerous and weaker. While the reasons for Russian performance are complex, it's not unimaginable that some people blamed it on the planes themselves. For example, Russian ground targeting systems, recon systems and air-to-ground weapons seem to be fairly lacking. But that technological issue is something that's not war's fault. The war only showed something that was apparent for quite some time now. Back in the 1990s, Russia leveraged heavily onto the Soviet Union's weapons and subsystems programs, and those were still somewhat competitive back in the day. But as the 2000s came, the pace of development of Western fighters and their subsystems continued. Sure, it too dropped from the Cold War era, but not as drastically as Russian pace. Russia was investing way less money into its military aerospace sector compared to the Soviet Union. Such development is always funded through defense budgets, and the difference is staggering. So it's no wonder that over time the capabilities of Russian hardware lagged more and more behind other competitors. In fact, it was often third-party countries that paid for development of various weapon systems. India, for example, pretty much paid for the Su-30 MKI advanced gear. But as 2020 approached, India got to a point where its technology and engineering became good enough to try to invest its money onto its own domestic weapon systems. The same thing happened with China, but much earlier. Around 2002 or so, a contract for a local assembly of 200 Sukhois was cut in half, prematurely, as China realized it can produce equally good or better planes on its own. Around the same time, China bought the last of its Su-30s, and then it wasn't until 2015 that China bought another Russian plane. The 2015 order for 24 Su-35s is peculiar. It could have been that China wanted to see what the best Russian technology could offer, or it was some sort of political arrangement with Russia to help promote its new product. China has not ordered any Russian fighter jets since. Without India and China, Russia had to increasingly rely on smaller countries, requiring fewer planes. Before we go on, a quick mention if we may. We made another Patreon exclusive and YouTube channel member exclusive video, not about Russian planes, but about the importance of reloading the US shipborne VLS systems while at sea. If that sort of thing sounds interesting to you, feel free to follow the link to the video, given below in the video description. All members, regardless of tier, can access it. Let us continue now. Basically, in the mid to late 2010s, Russia had three products. One was the MiG-29M, basically a land-based variant of the carrier-borne MiG-29K that India paid to be developed. Its biggest success was the mid-2010s contract for 50 planes to Egypt. Another was a Russian sub-variant of the Indian Su-30 MKI. Russia was selling it to the likes of Algeria and ex-Soviet countries, though total numbers weren't that high. Su-35 was supposed to be the next big thing, but, except for China, it never actually completed a sale, until Iran in 2023. Su-35 events are interesting and they help explain why Russia is selling so few planes. As with any plane, there are countless rumors about sales to various countries. Algeria in particular has been rumored to have ordered anything from Su-35 to Su-34 to even Su-57, but none of those rumors came to anything so far. But in 2018 the Su-35 did in fact get 2 official contract deals. One was for, quote, over 2 dozen planes to Egypt, Other was for 11 Su-35s to Indonesia. But neither country actually received any planes. So what happened? The US applied pressure. In August 2017, the US CAATSA, or Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, was signed into law. Basically, while before the US could apply political pressure to countries, it lacked political mechanisms that could be clearly presented to the US Congress. So that pressure had to be more covert and thus not as efficient. Since the new law, the justification of the political pressure was the law itself. The law is quite broad. It specifically mentions Iran, Russia, and North Korea as countries that need to be countered, but it also mentions it can be used for other purposes as well. So with that new era of more efficient sanctions, pressure was applied to both Egypt and Indonesia, and contracts were eventually dropped. Indonesia confirmed it in 2021, while for Egypt it was only the Egyptian media that reported on the cancelled contract in 2022. Those decisions obviously happened earlier than that. In fact, some 24 Su-35s could be observed around the factory in Russia painted in Egyptian camo scheme as recently as mid-2023, with first airframes visible in 2020. Those were never delivered to Egypt, and are almost surely the airframes that Iran is getting instead. It's very plausible the US applied pressure to other countries to dissuade them from even finalizing contracts with Russia, but there is no way to know for sure. Some countries had certain individual sanctions after the fact. China's Equipment Development Department was sanctioned in 2018 because of earlier Su-35 and Su-400 purchases. In 2020, Turkey was sanctioned due to its purchase of the S-400 system. Back then, Turkey was also looking into Russian planes, but nothing came out of it, possibly in part due to US pressure. Even businesses involved in the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline were sanctioned, some using CAATSA sanctions, and some relying on other laws and other sanctions. It shows that not even Germany, a NATO ally, is outside the reach of such a mechanism. As CAATSA is a US law, it's the US who decides who to sanction and how much. For example, in 2022, the US Congress passed a waiver for CAATSA sanctions for India, who bought the S-400 SAM system from Russia. Justification was that it's important for India to use the system to counter China. At the same time, additional Indian jet fighter orders from Russia may be curtailed due to the US. So basically, the CAATSA is a tool that the US can apply any way it pleases to anyone, or selectively not use it, if it suits its needs. In such a climate, it was hard for Russia to sell weapons to anyone even before the war, and since 2022 that became nearly impossible. Who would want to be associated with Russia buying weapons from it? Thus, it's only Iran who decided to buy Su-35s, as Iran is already working tightly with Russia and supplying Russia with various weapons. In 2021, Sukhoi unveiled its Checkmate fighter jet proposal. That was not an easy sell even back then. Since then, Russian Air Force is unlikely to finance its development, as it needs more money for the war instead of spending it on future long-term development, sort of just like what happened to the T-14 tank. Furthermore, very few countries will want to co-finance development of a new plane with Russia after the war started, so Checkmate's future is quite unsure. It looks as if it's gonna have a very protracted development at best. Su-57's development is more or less finished, but again, who's gonna buy it from a country that invaded Ukraine? Iran is a possibility, sure, but the list is short. And the same could be applied to pretty much any other older plane Russia might have. Algeria, once a trusted client, seems to have applied a wait-and-see stance. It may also turn to China for future orders. Of course, who's to say that the US won't apply pressure to dissuade countries from buying Chinese weapons as well? It all depends on the country being pressured, of course. Some countries bought planes from Russia even after CAATSA became a law, but most of those seem to be poor countries which bought second-hand planes and which the US doesn't seem to have an interest in. Ethiopia signed a contract for a pair of jets in 2022, Myanmar ordered 6 in 2018, and Mongolia got 6 second-hand MiGs in 2019. Myanmar doesn't have good relations with the US as it is, as the US has previously sanctioned it heavily, so further sanctions because of planes were not much of a factor. Syria seems to have received some planes, but again, its government is sanctioned as it is. Basically, it appears that Russia is currently selling only to a very narrow circle of countries friendly to it, mostly regimes that the West doesn't approve of, and the big countries like China and India simply have no need for Russian hardware anymore. MiG-29 and MiG-35 seem to be pretty much dead in the water, with not even the Russian Air Force buying any. Other planes are having some future, but that is solely because the Russian Air Force is waging a war and it needs many replacement planes. It's very questionable when will Russia start exporting a large number of planes to a large number of countries once again. In fact, it's possible that may not happen for decades. That's it for this video. Thanks goes to Surfshark for sponsoring us. Don't forget to click the link below the video to get their great discount. And remember, Binkov may talk about war, but only real peace can bring us all together.